Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in this beautiful world today. You are in the right place if you are here for the webinar, The Playbook on Launching a Successful Chapter Model and What You Need to Know. I am so glad that you're here with us today. I am Terry Cardin. I'm the founder of ReviewMyAMS.com and creator of an event called AMS Fest. We just wrapped up AMS Fest last week, and the lovely MemberNova team was there. But no fear if you're looking to see all the latest and greatest in the AMS world, including demos and thought leadership. Keep an eye out for the next one that's happening next year in June in Chicago. For all of those details, you can check out amsfest.com. And I am just super stoked to be hanging out with you guys today. But what's even better than getting this special time together today with Jake and Hallie is all of the sweet supporters of ReviewMyAMS.com. Yes, I use the word sweet because they are awesome and they are proud to be supporters of Review My AMS, including our co-hosts for today, the MemberNova team. For those of you that may not know, Review My AMS is home to more than 1,000, yes, oh my gosh, I can't believe we've hit that 1,000 mark, end user reviews on more than 65 association management systems. When companies like MemberNova support Review My AMS, it means that they stand for transparency in what is our very convoluted, confusing AMS marketplace, and they understand the importance of the association professional's voice. Association professionals like Jake, who is here with us today. They get it. They get that the opinions on technology matter, and they're listening to what's happening in our space. I'm going to turn it over to Hallie and Jake in just a few moments, but let me cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be accessible on the Review My AMS blog next week, along with some great takeaways from what we learned today. So you can dig for it there in the Review My AMS blog, or you can just harass me at any time, and I'll get that recording to you. And of course, if you find today's webinar helpful, you're more than welcome to share it with a colleague or perhaps a board member or anybody else in your association world that might be considering chapters. We have a feeling that you're going to also have a lot of questions for Jake and Hallie, and that's great. We want your questions, but so that we don't interrupt the flow of today's webinar, we're going to take the last few minutes to field all of those burning questions of yours. But don't wait till the end to ask your questions at any time during the presentation. Feel free to address Hallie or Jake and ask your questions while it's right there, on your mind. And I will make sure that we get to your question there at the end. So now let's get down to today's business. And for that, I'm going to introduce you to my friends at MemberNova and my new friend Jake at the Computer Science Teachers Association. Hallie is the co-founder and COO of MemberNova. She, along with her amazing team, has been serving the nonprofit space for over 15 years. Her expertise in working with all types of organizations, especially chapter-based associations, is what has led MemberNova to grow to support over 5,000 customers across 100 countries. And the coolest part is in more than 12 languages. Holy cow, that's awesome. Maybe we can find out from Hallie how many languages she actually speaks. And Jake, a little bit about Jake. He is the executive director of the Computer Science Teachers Association, the world's leading association for K-12 computer science teachers. That was one of my favorite classes, by the way, Jake. Jake is a former high school computer science teacher, department chair, and professional development provider with the Chicago Public Schools. As a teacher, he focused on increasing access to computing for underrepresented groups and more than doubled female enrollment in introductory computer science classes. Personally, I can tell you I love hearing that, Jake. Thanks so much for that. But prior to joining CSTA, he was Director of State Government Affairs for Code.org, where he worked with educators, policymakers to advocate for policies that expanded high-access, high-quality computer science education with state departments, education of governors' offices across the country. Gosh, I can't wait to hear what all Jake has to offer for us today. Cool thing I learned about Jake just recently, fun fact, is that he's written 2 poetry books. So those are our fine educators for today. If that doesn't tell you a little bit about how excited I am about listening to this, I don't know what possibly could. So take it away, Hallie and Jake.
All right. Thank you so much, Terry. I'm so excited about today's webinar because, as you mentioned, I worked for over 15 years with chapter-based organizations, from the startups to mature 100-year-old organizations, and there really isn't one secret sauce, so to speak, but hopefully what we're going to do is we're going to expose all the nuances and the differences between the different ways you can set up chapter models, and what are some of the things you have to kind of keep in mind as we really, how you want to be able to support chapters. So this is a little bit of like a little agenda of how we're going to run through this. We're going to talk about dues, we're going to talk about data, really being kind of the biggest challenge. How technology is really key to being able to support your chapters, and then using that to actually further your branding efforts and how important that is. And then at the very end, we're going to just kind of touch on the whole us versus them and making sure that you don't get into a situation where your chapters kind of go against you. So, and I think Jake is going to really be doing a lot of experience shares. I think we'll try to kind of dabble into all the different, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and super excited to get into it.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to share with you all.
All right. So, what are chapters? A lot of times people are like, so isn't that just a region or a section or, just another kind of way of looking at, how to divide up your membership? I think I want to start off the webinar by really saying that even though they are part of your organization, the biggest difference really is that they are their own entities. And I think that, what Jake can really speak to is how they have set up the chapters, and this being kind of one of many ways. And obviously, we don't want to kind of give any type of legal advice, but we just want to kind of make you aware that there's not just kind of a one way to create chapters. So Jake, maybe you can kind of start by telling us how you set up your chapter structure with the Computer Science Teachers Associations and why, and what were the benefits of going that way?
Yeah, so CSTA is an association that has over 36,000 members worldwide, with about 2/3 of those located in the U.S. and predominantly focus our chapter efforts within the U.S. We have 78 chapters now, covering 45 states and Puerto Rico, with a few information to have the entire U.S. covered by the end of this programmatic year for us. And in thinking about our chapters and how we set them up, it always comes back to us the strong belief that the chapters are the lifeblood of our organization. It's the point where members are having the most real, meaningful person-to-person contact and making connections, learning, and growing together. And everything we do to approach chapters is realizing that they are an incredible asset to what we do as an organization. I'm not going to get the chance to meet most of our members, but our chapter leaders and volunteers are all taking our message to them, and it's the site where things happen. In thinking about how we set them up, we wanted to find that balance of being able to make sure they were their own entities, have the ability to fundraise on their own, to develop programs on their own as they grow, while making it as easy as possible to support them in what they do. So for us, that led to a blended model where we're going to be able to share our 501c3 status across our chapters, make that easier for them, but not take on all of the liability that goes with everything they do, and really finding that balance, which has been perfect for us. As we thought about this, my biggest piece of advice here is not looking at your chapters as they are now, but really coming up with the vision of what they should be as they grow over time. Our chapters are going through dramatic growth right now, and we wanted to make sure we chose something that would fit them 5 years from now, not what would be the quickest or easiest thing to do next week or next month.
That's great. And showing that leadership, they may not be thinking 5 years down the line. They just want to get up and running and start doing all of the great work. But you have to kind of, set the stage and be like, hey guys, you're going to run into this 5 years from now, so this is what we advise you to do. And we'll get into more ways of proactively supporting your chapters. And I think that, really I think the point here is that to look at chapters as an extension of your organization that has local presence, and they're not cookie cutters. They are all unique in their own ways, even if you're not international. So, the way people speak and the way they, connect with you and the way that they may think could be different. We were having a conversation earlier about, what 50 degrees means, and to me, I think Celsius, and Jake thinks Fahrenheit, because I'm located in Canada. So if you're not aware of things like that and the localization of your messaging, then that's really what chapters can take care of. So to really give that cultural match to the members at a local level. So I think that's really important to think about, and as we kind of move on and think about how you're supporting your chapters, I wanted to kind of mention that, so based on our experience with other organizations, large and small, you can go as elaborate and as structured as you wanted with training and dedicated people, but really the kind of the common theme is that you're proactively supporting your chapters, you're kind of thinking ahead for them, but there's also kind of a reactive support. So Jake, how do you guys at CSTA really support your chapters?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I want to be really upfront that this is a lot of work, and you need to think about dedicating resources in terms of staff time, in terms of funding, and other supports you can roll out to help chapters get up off the ground and keep them moving. We have a full-time position focused on supporting all of our chapters, and all of our chapters are then led by fully volunteer teams in their regions. So when we think about the support piece, it starts with having that consistent face that our leaders know they can go to, they can ask any sort of question to, they can get ideas and support from. We also have worked to build a community between the chapter leads so that they're starting to learn from each other at the same time. And that really can take off when we have online spaces for them to connect, but we also make sure to have an in-person point of connection every year in line with our annual conference, where chapter leaders can have space to focus on learning from each other. They collaboratively build out a program for this sort of day-and-a-half experience together. And what's wonderful about it is different chapter leads are able to run different portions of that program and highlight their work and share what's been most effective for them. This continues throughout the year through messaging that we put out, where we can take something we see as successful in one place and really highlight what that looks like to all the other chapters. It's been especially effective when we build that into a grant program that we've rolled out so that chapters are able to apply for funding to initiate new projects and then highlight what that looks like. I will throw another plug here. If that all sounds like fun work to you, we are actually hiring for a chapter relations manager right now, and I encourage you to check out csteachers.org to see the position and let us know if you'd like to join in and help continue to grow our chapter network and support this incredible group of volunteers.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, we are so excited. I would also add in terms of support, it's really important for us to understand who our volunteers are and what sort of capacity they have. I think our association, focusing on K-12 teachers, has very different resources, time, talent to dedicate to what our chapters could look like versus some of the peers that, I'm based in Chicago, and we see, huge associations focused on professional fields that make much higher salaries than a teacher does, and being really aware of what our members are looking for and what we can ask of our volunteers before it becomes too much. And that's been an important balance to strike in thinking about ways we can support even really small in dollar amount resources that make a huge difference in a volunteer leader's life.
Mm-hmm. No, that's wonderful. And for the attendees that are in session right now, post in the comments. We'd love to know what does your organization do? If you are a chapter-based organization, how do you support chapters? We're going to be putting together a little summary after this webinar of everything we kind of talked about, and we'd love to include that input as well. And I think, I think for Jake, who's really, for across 78 chapters and 36,000 members, I mean, that's a great size organization. As you get more and more, larger and mature, you might think about, we've worked with organizations that have a very formal evaluation process that they go through, where they're really tracking, helping the chapter really track how they're accomplishing their goals, and are they meeting all of the things that they set out to do. And then they create a badge system that kind of says, hey, you're a superstar chapter, or you're great, and then being able to kind of relate some of the different badges to the actual amounts of funding that they could receive. So that's also another way to really incentivize them to stay on track. So I think that the other thing is, as you grow internationally, you might want to think about that relationship manager really expanding into several relationship managers that are really staggered. And I think, Jake, you guys are strictly North America today, but is there any thought about going international, and what are your thoughts about going from national to international?
Yeah, so we're really excited to think about what the outside of the U.S. and outside of North America perspective could look like for our organization, and are planning to launch a pilot over the next year that will start up to 5 new chapters that will exist outside of the U.S., most likely outside of North America. And thinking about that is really exciting, as I mentioned. Also daunting, because of we know how important it is to understand the membership that you're working with, and thinking about what that looks like with different education systems, potentially different languages, and being able to provide resources that are meaningful. So from that front, we're really trying to get into the details of how we can build the most turnkey resources possible. We won't be able to be hands-on in the same way with some of our international chapters that we are right now with our current set of chapters, and making sure we pick the right starting point so that they can really be the leaders and I think develop with us a lot of the resources that would go into further international expansion.
Absolutely. And I think when you start thinking about different languages and different currencies, I think you have to come back to the legal setup as well, because with some of the organizations we've worked with, you might have to, chapters might have to comply with their own jurisdiction as far as how they are established as an entity. So you definitely want to be mindful of that and get the proper advice if you are thinking of going down the road. And it probably would be a multi-year process to be able to even get to that stage, but it's always good to think about.
Yeah, and Hallie, I'd add in one, and this maybe goes back to earlier in the chapter setup decisions, but one thing that we have intentionally not been strict in deciding is the sort of geographic size of a chapter, because of how different locations sort of view what everything from a 30-minute drive means to who's part of the group they would normally associate with geographically. We have some chapters that are as small as a single city, where others are covering an entire state in the U.S. And as we think about international expansion, we would also want to find, do some experimentation with different grain sizes of chapters as that rolls out. The one thing we've learned really clearly is if you try to force a specific size, there will be someone who pushes back on that, and allowing some flexibility there has made it a lot more collaborative in our work with our leaders.
I think that's probably a good advice across the board for a lot of the different aspects of managing a chapter. So that brings us to the next topic, which is really how are you going to handle dues? And just to speak to that first is just working with so many different organizations, there really is no one set formula. So it really depends on what makes sense for your organization, whether you go for a centralized model where all members really join at the national or international level, and then they can go and pick, maybe they can belong to more than one chapter. This is also something, it's a decision you want to make, is do you want to allow members to really just belong to one or multiple? And then, you may find that some chapters want to charge their own dues, in which case there are so many ways of going about it. Do you take that funding through the national, or is it something where they kind of have to pay two different entities? And then you have to think about the member experience. Like, that's not really a great member journey, is signing up once, paying one entity, and then you decide to sign up with this other entity and having to do a separate charge. So you want to eliminate that friction as much as possible. And I think so it starts with what the member onboarding really looks like. So, and we've seen it even the other way around, where if you start to feel that your chapters are really who are going after the members, and maybe start the journey from the chapter level, and then national just kind of gets sent off behind the scenes with the member not really aware. So Jake, how does CSTA manage its dues, and how does that relate to the chapters?
Yeah, that's a great question, and dues are always such a tricky thing to think about from a management perspective, from a member messaging perspective, and in my time at CSTA, I've had the pleasure of being the executive director who rolled out the first set of dues for the organization. It's historically been a free association, and we've introduced a new tier of membership that has a due attached to it. And I sort of joke about the pleasure of being able to roll that out, because no one's ever happy when you start charging for something, but it really provided a unique opportunity for us to make it clear that we're stepping up. We're going to provide more value to our members and hold ourselves accountable to it, and give members a way to show that and really say, yes, this matters to me, and give us that feedback. And I found that it really changes the relationship that we have as staff with membership, and how we think about what we're going to do. So I'd encourage finding ways to make that happen. But when we talk about dues from a chapter perspective, and I think overall, it's so important to remember that they're just a means to something. It is a way to bring some resources in so that we can do something great for our members. And what drives our volunteer leadership, and what drives everyone on our team, is making sure that we're providing really outstanding support to teachers who are in really tough environments, where they're often underappreciated, where they're working incredibly long hours. And so when we know that that's the mindset coming in, we knew immediately that a chapter leader, a volunteer who's a peer of someone coming in, is not going to feel comfortable saying, well, you've got to pay to walk in the door and get this valuable professional development. So we really wanted to create a model that made it possible for anyone who needed the support to come and be a part of a chapter, and then add on our additional value through this new membership tier that could bring in some revenue to keep everything going at the same time. So for us, that means membership all runs through national. We're not expecting someone to be a gatekeeper at a chapter door collecting money. And we think about it as how we can bring that in and then dedicate resources back to the chapter. And an explicit commitment of our premium membership tiers that half of those dues will support chapter programs throughout the year, so that members see that going back to the work that's closest to them.
And I think that really resulted in a great growth for your chapters year over year. And I think when we first started talking, you were only at 30,000 members. I didn't know you were up at 36,000 now. That's wonderful. So speaking of all that data and all of the exchange of information that's going on, I think that really leads us to the biggest challenge that I know that I'm aware of facing chapter-based organizations, which is really, how are you going to get all the pieces together? How are you going to get the data? New members coming in, members leaving, people changing their contact information all the time, and thinking about, well, if this is all happening at the chapter level, because that's really where their highest touch point is, how does that information flow back to national? Because you really need to understand metrics, and you need to be able to say, well, this region is really experiencing explosive growth. Let's take a look at what they're doing. Or maybe this region is kind of struggling a little bit, and this really feeds into your ability to support them accordingly. So, and then how does it all work if you take on a new organization like CSTA has? So, Jake, do you want to speak to how you guys solve that problem?
Yeah, so this was absolutely the biggest challenge that we've been addressing, and that I focused on since coming on board, I've been in the executive director role here at CSTA for approaching 2 years now, and so I'm excited to be on the verge of being able to share much more growth data and specific numbers. When we think about chapters, there had been a long period where our chapters were really growing independently, which meant they were doing some great things, but we didn't know about it, and also building up things like member lists and programmatic data that never made its way back to us, and we couldn't consolidate and share to highlight the organization's growth, which is essential for us as we think about bringing in supporters to the organization. We've really done 2 key things to help turn that around. One, it links back to the support piece. We worked really closely with our chapter leadership to develop a new rubric that defines chapter success, and that we use to help chapters see where they are and where they want to be over the next year. So from our perspective, there's a lot of data that they bring to the table that goes into that, and it's an opportunity to have them share that with us from a programmatic aspect, and also provide data around where they want to grow, which maps out the supports we should be providing over the next year. The second piece of that was rolling out our new AMS and chapter system, which allowed each chapter to have their own chapter-owned and lab website and membership system, but that all feeds into one database. So now when a member joins a chapter, the chapter leader knows about it immediately. We know about it immediately. We make sure they're part of all of the messaging that goes out. They don't miss out on any of the research or newsletters that come out from National. Everyone feels like they're getting more information more quickly. And it was really important to us that chapters felt this was a benefit at the same time that we did, because before that, they were really collecting a lot of that information without it getting to us. So finding a way to link that and having a system that pulls that all together has been key to allow us to pull that together and make sure we're tracking things much more closely. Now we know how many members are in each chapter and how those are changing over time. And before, that was something that if we were lucky, we would collect once a year, and it would often feel like pulling teeth. So that's been a huge turnaround for us.
That's great. And actually, for those attendees, we'd love to hear how you get this information from chapters. If you could add that to the chat, in terms of, do you ask for an Excel sheet every year, or do you ask them to log in and upload the information? So it is a very common problem. Don't feel bad. We've seen it all, and I think it really ties into kind of, especially when Jake, when you were talking about allowing all of your chapters to really have the ability to have their own set of tools. This is really a part of your support as National is giving them or leading them or giving them guidelines into the tools that they're going to need to be able to engage their members, run their operation, and be able to grow. And I know that it's really about not forcing something down their throats, but at the same time, it's almost like a balance between a guideline and giving them complete autonomy. And really having, thinking about it, not from the perspective of, you're one of our chapters, you must do this, but really selling the idea to them and telling them benefit and really turning it into a solution that's a win-win. So I know, Jake, you guys, did a few different things maybe before you started with the organization. Maybe you could, share your experience of, what worked, what didn't work, kind of some of the things to watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll go back to data for a second, because Holly, you had also asked about this idea of merging, and I didn't get to that, so I want to make sure I touch on the fact that we were able to bring in a program that was being run in a single state, a Computer Science Honor Society, and launched that nationally across the U.S. in the last 6 months, which has been a wonderful opportunity for us to bring this outstanding program to more teachers across the country. And it also created this situation of having a program with a set of teachers that were running societies across their schools already, and how do we merge that into what we already have. Because we now have been pulling our data together and have it in a system that is pulling in that chapter information, we were able to build out a model for the honor societies that linked directly to the member records we already had for those leaders, and actually now build that in as a member benefit for the CSTA Plus tier. So before, there would have been a level of manual management that could have made that project either much more costly or not possible to roll out on the time frame it did. But now that we can link that data together, we have a much clearer sense of how that's all happening.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that happens all the time, is that an organization will merge with another one, and what do you do at that point? So going into the toolkits, how did CSTA first approach chapters? What were you guys providing them, or did you give them guidelines, or was it just basically a Wild West and you said, hey, do whatever you want to do, we're not going to dictate? What are the pros and cons of both of those extremes?
Yeah. So as we've been saying over and over again, it's always been about finding the balance between those two poles. CSTA has in forming a chapter, we have things like a template for bylaws and some guidelines of minimum expectations to get started, and then supports that we try to roll out that suggest here are the things that you should be doing in your first year. And again, when we think about it, it's really focused on making the volunteer leader's life as easy as possible, because they're busy, they're taking on a lot, and this is an extra thing. So when we position some of the new resources we've been rolling out, we wanted to make sure that it was as easy as possible and as useful as possible to have things like a new web platform or a new membership system, so that they view it as a benefit initially. So that's really, you're really well positioned to do that for all new chapters moving forward. It was a little trickier when we thought about the rollout to our existing set of chapters when we made our transition. And we really focused on finding chapter leaders who could be our champions throughout that process. We brought on a cohort of chapter leaders that were involved in the review process and in helping test the system before it went live, and also recruited a set of chapters to be our models that on day one could say, here's what our website looks like, here's what our system looks like, here's how our newsletters are functioning, because it's much better to have them tell the story than have it come from me or someone on staff who might not be viewed as much of a peer.
No, I think that's a really good point. Just to kind of highlight that a little bit is I like the fact that you got them involved at the review stage. It wasn't just, hey, we've made a decision, give us your feedback, but it's going to happen regardless of what you say. It's really involving them in all that, and I think that's a really good thing to kind of keep in mind regardless of what the project is.
Yeah, and I'll add, as new tools have rolled out, we've never said you absolutely have to use this starting right now. There's always phase-in time, there's always options to transition over or to continue using some pieces of what you're using, because no one is going to respond well to that mandate, and it doesn't show that we care. Whereas instead we can sort of say, here's this benefit, here's something that will make your life much easier, here's a grant that could really help you do something. Well, if you want to use the grant, it ties into something like this and finding that balance.
Absolutely, and I think you mentioned the template bylaws, but it could be member surveys or graphics or anything like that. And actually, this ties us into the next topic really well, which is branding. So I know that organizations work so hard on trying to build the brand, create consistency, and if you don't have chapters, you have great control over that. You pretty much you oversee everything that goes out there. But once you expand into multiple chapters, I think it starts to get a little bit tough to keep the branding uniform. Sometimes it's, we've worked with organizations where they really struggle with trying to almost police the brand identity, because chapters will kind of flip the logo upside down or stick it next to something else where they shouldn't be doing that. And it starts to become really important to have that visual identity guideline. So for those of you in attendance, let us know, does your organization have an identity guideline that goes over things like what your voice and tone is, or how to use the logo, what colors to use. And I know there's a lot of money that gets spent on branding agencies to do that, but then you roll it out to your chapters and they're just like, okay, whatever, that's nice, we're going to do it this way. So Jake, how do you guys enforce your brand? Well, I guess enforce is a strong word, but how do you tackle that?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to come back to positioning it as a benefit to chapters, and positioning, I guess, sounds manipulative. I don't want to make it seem that way at all. A brand is only useful if it's a benefit to your chapters, and so that should go into how you design it and why you use it. And we believe that the brand that we've rolled out is incredibly useful to our chapters in providing the right balance of consistency and freedom to identify with their local community. And that's because we know, as I said from the beginning, that members most strongly associate with their local chapter. And so we needed to think about branding that allowed each local chapter to have some sense of its own identity while fitting into a larger structure. So we built out a system that has a lot of consistency across our logo, with chapters picking their own names, with having some control over the color scheme that rolls out with that, as a way to really create that space that still is your own. And I'm proud to have a big CSTA Chicago sticker on the back of my laptop, because that's where I am, and that's the chapter that I was a part of. And so that was really important to us. And then the second piece was building the brand into things that made their life easier. So that is most clear in websites, where initially CSTA chapters have been setting up their own websites, and in wanting to build consistency, we wanted to also provide tools that made it easier to have your own website that fit within a platform that could stand on its own. And so we built out templates that allow chapters to start up their websites already being consistent with the branding that we have, with content and images that allow them to really quickly get something up and running, and be able to add more that fits their needs while staying within the brand guidelines. That was a really big for us. And then as we think about what branding looks like beyond that, in terms of the tone of the organization, it's as important for our tone to make sure it matches what our chapters are saying to us, than something that we're setting. Again, we should be the voice of our membership. We are the voice of K-12 CS teachers, and that means that our tone should be set from the bottom up. And so that's a place where we try to learn from our members, as opposed to pushing it out as something that comes from the central organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen as well, setting up digital asset management tools, or even just, it doesn't even have to be a fancy program. It could just be a Google Drive that you make available to all of your chapter officers, where they can download sample graphics, photographs, press releases, announcements. When they do have a press release, there's always the About section at the bottom. Give them an easy place to kind of find that, copy and paste it, so they're not sitting there reinventing the wheel over and over again, and then, but allowing them to kind of put their own spin on it. And again, this should be something that is, gently reminded every year as part of your training, as part of the check-ins. Again, you don't have to go as far as some of the more mature organizations that actually have an evaluation, and they actually go and check the chapter websites, and they'll do these random visual checks, and they're like, oh, you used the wrong color logo, and this is actually our old logo. And but it's important, because I think that the strength of the chapter is really to fall back on the entire group, the sum of the parts, and so you don't get that strength if everybody's got their own brand, because we as humans, we relate to consistency, and so you start to see that brand, it reinforces the mission. So I definitely think that's a great place to start if you're not even sure where to start with supporting your chapters. So that kind of takes us to the last topic that we wanted to talk about. It's probably the most negative one, but I'm sure we'll find a good way to put a positive spin on it. And this is really the us versus them mentality. And I'm sure, Jake, you don't have that in your great organization, but that's it's one of these things you want to make sure that you avoid, because if you're not involved in your chapters, in addressing their challenges, supporting them in their initiatives and keeping them aligned with the vision of your association, they could start to go off on their own and start to create this big brother mentality where they see national or international as, this kind of annoying entity that's kind of, interfering or, kind of getting in the way of what they're trying to do as a chapter. So, how do you tackle that? How do you make sure first of all, you avoid that situation? And if you do find yourself in a situation where your chapters are kind of, not really feeling the love, how do you address that?
Yeah, this is such a tricky balance, and I think we are really lucky in working hard to make sure we center chapters as the most important thing we do as an organization, and continually share that with them, and try to make it clear in the resources we provide and the way we dedicate our time and towards supporting them. But the things we found most useful in doing that starts in engaging and including them early on. We talked a little bit about including them in some of the testing and reviewing of potential features that we would roll out or supports that we would provide. But it also has to do with finding places to hear from them. I focused in my first sort of 6 months in coming on board I set aside an afternoon once a week that was just meeting with chapter leaders and hearing about what was happening, because they're the eyes and ears of what we're doing, and making sure that message comes back to the full organization helps make it clear that we're here as a support. I think the second thing is coming back to the way we set up the chapter success rubric, and really trying to build a transparent system that highlights what we jointly care about and how we're working towards it together. The disagreements come up when we're not focused on the values that brought these volunteers to want to start a chapter, to want to run this organization that aligns with our goals. And so that goes both ways. Sometimes we have to stop and say, we really wanted this for whatever, but that isn't what we're here to do. So maybe the chapter's right. Maybe we need to have some flexibility there to make sure that we keep that that context and perspective central to who we are. This comes to me so often because, as I mentioned, I came to this organization in this role as a teacher and member of a chapter, and saw how important that on-the-ground day-to-day work is.
Absolutely, and I think it's very similar to a company that starts up and needs to identify its not just its core values, but what its pillars are. What are you really trying to do, and communicating that for proper alignment with the chapters. So everything that they do really has to fall under one of these strategies, and say, well, and that's the first question you might ask. I'm sure on that plan that you want to have them fill out is, how does this project, align with one of these 5 pillars that we're going after. And I think that, what I've, a little bit of an experience share on my end, working with, very large international organization, is they rolled out a system where chapters could actually, write up what their goals are, what their project is, and they actually publicized it on the website, so that internally to other chapters they can kind of scroll through and see, hey, this is what the activities the other chapters are doing. But the most important thing is the first thing to identify was under which of these 5 pillars does this fall under. So that really definitely, promotes that alignment, and helps you be able to kind of identify who's really, what are chapters really, what do they really care about? And if you find that, they really only care about these 3 pillars, well, what are we doing about these other 2? Does it really matter to the organization anymore? Maybe we should just kind of focus on these 3, and maybe we should dive deeper into one of them, because that's where everybody seems to be focusing on nowadays. So in terms of being able to also avoid the us versus them, especially from an international perspective, I think this is where you really want to definitely have the regional contacts. That would be one of the biggest ways that you can kind of address any kind of cultural, miscommunications. A lot of times, you write something and you translate it and it just doesn't come across the same way. So it's become super important when you're international, and something you want to think about for sure. But I definitely agree that having the frequent check-ins and looking at it from the perspective of the chapters come first, a chapter-centric organization, flip that org chart upside down. It's not national at the top. It's the chapters, and the headquarters is really just at the very bottom, supporting the chapters in what they're doing. And I think just a little tweak like that gets them thinking the right way.
Yeah, and I'll add, it really, I think something we're working to get better at, and I'll admit we've misstepped on at times, is not just thinking about how we support chapters to do their thing, but then they're bringing members to us, but looking at how we can make sure members are getting to the chapters and know about what local communities are available around them. And that can look like new things we're trying. A really simple one is setting up, your new member drip email campaign to make sure that if someone hasn't joined a chapter after X days, you're sending them a message saying, here are the 3 in your state or in your region, make sure you join, or why haven't you? And similarly, we think about the moments when we really rally the larger national and global community, and making sure that's an opportunity not just to celebrate we're all CSTA together, but highlight that everyone here is also a part of those communities. So we have our annual conference is our biggest event for that, which I'm sure is common to many people on this webinar, and finding ways to make sure that people can highlight that they're parts of chapters in that larger community. We think about signage that our chapter leaders can show off, simple things, ribbons or stickers that say, I'm a part of this chapter, or ask me about this, so that the chapters all see that we're, as a national organization, working to push out and support the growth that they're aiming for as well.
Yeah, no, and then just really, I think also, national can really play a part in publicizing chapters. So, throughout their communications or public relations, they could highlight and showcase what chapters are doing. We've also seen a lot of organizations have award systems for, what is a chapter that grew the most this year, or who's made, the biggest impact, depending on what your strategy is for whether it's fundraising or, philanthropy or whatever your mission may be. So that way they really feel like they are the focus, and, National really celebrates in their milestones just as much as they do locally. All right. So I think that pretty much is everything that we had covered. So Terry, if you want to take it away, I think we wanted to see if there were any questions that were being asked.
Okay, wow, guys. This was super helpful. I have been kind of out of the chapter loop, massive confession here, for quite some time, but especially the branding, because I sat in the marketing department of my association. Just even thinking about the branding idea and trying to herd the cats, if you will. Like, I just was thinking, it was kind of sort of giving me the willies just thinking about all of the effort that has to go into making sure that you don't have wild, wild west going on with your organization's brand. Because Hallie, like you said, that can be very expensive and labor intensive. And so this was really great, guys. I learned a ton my own self. So thank you for your insights. So we do have a couple questions that came in, and I think this one came in not too long after Jake, your shameless plug there about your position that's open for the relations manager, chapter relations manager, which I threw out on Twitter, by the way, for you.
Oh, thank
so I was
you.
like, maybe. No, it sounds awesome. But the question is, what qualities make up a great chapter director, or maybe somebody that's in that chapter's department?
Oh, that is such a good question, and it is a tricky role for us to scope out and think about, because there are sort of two sets of skills that are really important, and there's often some balancing between the two that we think about. So one, I think, goes to the operational side of managing chapters and understanding sort of the structure and how it needs to flow within the organization, and that often comes from a lot of experience working with other chapters, seeing how chapters have successfully grown and it matured in their complexity over time. And the other aspect, and this probably isn't a surprise given what I said over and over again, is the importance of empathizing with the volunteers that are running chapters and being able to understand their experience, being able to understand what motivates them and their members. And that often comes from having experience as a chapter leader or in the field. And I'm trying to find folks that have both of those can be that needle in a haystack sometimes, but we really think about those as the two key elements.
Yeah, and I would add that with the chapter relationship managers that we've encountered, they're often very diplomatic. You really don't want somebody who's nope, that's the rule, this is our policy kind of thing. So you want them to be very open and, open to feedback and know how to navigate the relationship across different cultures, especially if you are going to be looking to be international, but even different cultures throughout North America. So I would definitely think that would be a great asset to have.
Yeah, I love the way you frame that. When I think of the role, what I think most importantly is this person is the full-time staff member who is always on the chapter side. That's what I want them to bring to the conversation and be pushing us internally on, versus someone who thinks of their role as taking the message from national and pushing it out to every chapter.
Yeah, they're actually the chapter advocate within national. Absolutely.
It's almost like you need like the chapter coach or something like that. Like you're like more the team player, or you're just sort of like the captain or something along those lines, where like this is your team, the chapters are your teams, and
Exactly.
Not that they're pitting against each other, but it's like, those are my teams that are out there, and so I kind of like that visual, that I can see exactly where you're coming from, which is a great segue to our next question. Thanks, Anne, for asking. What are some things to keep in mind when launching international chapters? And it sounds like, Jake, this might be something on the horizon for you, so maybe you've done a little research somewhere along the way on this topic and can fill us in on the thoughts that go along with that.
Yeah, I can share a little bit, and I'm actually sure Hallie is much more experienced at thinking about this, given MemberNova's large global reach. From our perspective, it's really come down to thinking about how we can focus what we want to do at the global level from a chapter perspective, and really looking at, there's the legal implications and understanding what we can and can't provide, and mostly being really upfront in this pilot phase of what we can't provide and how limited some of the supports will be, so that folks know what they're getting into. And then the second is thinking about how you're going to handle language especially. And so we're going to be continuing to focus our initial rollout on supporting through all of our current things that are produced in English, and looking for folks that are open to launching with a focus on the English language before rolling out more broadly, because I think that's going to be a huge shift. And again, we think of it as how can we make sure we're upfront and honest about what we can do and what our limitations are, so that folks don't feel caught partway through this process.
Yeah, and I could definitely add to that. And one of those things is actually the decision at national to decide, or international, to decide what your official languages of support are going to be. So just because you have chapters, let's say in Germany, France, and Spain, doesn't mean those necessarily have to be the official language of support. You may just say, you know what, we're just going to do English and Spanish for now. And being upfront about that, and once you do announce that you're going to be supporting those languages, you have to be prepared that every communication, every newsletter, every document, your website as well, you have to be prepared to roll out the content in all of the languages. So it actually represents a whole other dimension to everything that you do. And if you're not prepared for that, if you don't start thinking about that, additional resource and time that really affect your planning, you might want to rethink. But I definitely agree that a good baby step is to say, look, we're still going to stay English only. I have seen lots of chapters all over the world that are English speaking, and that's definitely a really good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the barrier to success anymore is not necessarily the language anymore, right? Like there's so many tools out there so if you can keep it limited and use some of the tools that are provided to us within, the systems and the great wide internet out there, that that it does seem like it could be a little less intimidating than what it sounds. So that's really good advice, guys. So we have time, it looks like, for 2 more questions. One is for Jake, and then the last one's for Hallie. So Jake, do you recognize chapters that are performing well in terms of retention, engagement, etc., or awards or anything along those lines? So if so, what are you doing there?
Yeah, we are trying really hard to recognize successes throughout the year as much as possible. I think a concrete small thing we do is we have a newsletter that goes out to our chapter leaders, and we make sure that within that there's a section in every newsletter that highlights the success of another chapter and gives them an opportunity to share in a short paragraph and some pictures what's going well, and view that as a way to just continuously highlight what's happening. Now that we have so that the chapter success rubric I talked about was just rolled out this past summer, and now that we have that in place, that's going to provide a really nice framework for us to also be able to share, here are the goals that chapter set. We can celebrate at our conference and at the chapter leader summit those that are doing well and hitting those goals and what's been successful. We absolutely want to show off what's happening, and it's been more in the informal, just being able to highlight their work versus a structured awards program or something like that.
So it sounds like a little peer pressure is really kind of what gets people motivated, which, I mean, all by itself, it is its own little motivator, right, even without the awards. So, human nature is to kind of like one up your player, right? So I keep bringing it back to that sports analogy.
Yeah, I was going to say we're all former teachers, and one thing you learn teaching is that adults and middle schoolers have a lot more in common than we'd like to admit.
Yep, I think you are right, and it's about that season right now too, isn't it? Okay, and then the last question comes from me, Hallie. Okay, I started at the top, and I don't think you told us. How many languages do you speak?
I actually speak 2 languages well, okay. one not so well, so I guess we could say 3 languages.
Okay, all right. I had to get that in there. So I figured you were at least bilingual. So, well, thank you so much to the MemberNova team, Hallie, for being proud supporters of Review Minus. From the bottom of my heart, it means so much, and it's organizations like yours, it's companies like yours that work alongside Smarties, like our executive director friend Jake here, and thank you for all your applicable insights today. It's awesome to hear all about the actual moving parts. And to all of our attendees today, thank you so much for being here. We hope that you were able to take in all of this good information about chapters. May your chapters or your future chapters be successful. I'll leave you with this quote. It's a healthy reminder by Zig Ziglar, that wise man. He once said, "You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great." So thanks, everybody, for being here. Y'all take care. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And just to add one little thing, if your question didn't get answered, or thank you for including some of the details about what you're doing at your organization, we will be sending up a follow-up email with some of the summaries of what we talked about, but we'll make sure to address any questions that you had in that one as well. And I want to thank Jake as well for joining me today. So thank you so much for sharing the insight. I'm sure it was super helpful for everybody. So very kind of you.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.